There is a moment in life that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but quietly changes everything. It doesn't come with a fight, it doesn't come with a final argument, and it rarely comes with an explanation. It arrives silently. One day, someone simply stops trying. They stop explaining themselves. They stop chasing conversations that go nowhere. They stop forcing connections that constantly leave them feeling drained. And slowly, almost invisibly, they begin to disappear from people's lives. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. To the outside world, this behavior often looks cold. People say things like, they changed. They became distant. They cut everyone off. But what most people never see is the long psychological journey that happens before someone reaches that point. Because people rarely wake up one morning and decide to walk away from everyone. The decision is almost always built over time, quietly, through hundreds of small moments that slowly reshape the way a person sees the world around them. A conversation where they realize they're not really being heard. A situation where their kindness is mistaken for weakness. A relationship where they keep giving energy, but never seem to get any back. At first, they try to ignore it. Most people do. They convince themselves it's normal. They tell themselves relationships require sacrifice. They tell themselves loyalty means enduring discomfort. So they keep showing up. They keep answering messages. They keep supporting people. They keep playing the role everyone expects them to play. But something subtle begins to happen inside their mind. The emotional fatigue starts building, not loudly, just a quiet weight that grows heavier over time. Until eventually, a simple realization begins to form, one that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. My life might actually feel lighter without all of this. That thought is powerful, because once someone begins to imagine a life with more peace, it becomes very difficult to keep tolerating what constantly disturbs it. Psychologists often describe this turning point as a shift in emotional awareness. For the first time, a person stops asking, "How do I keep everyone happy?" and begins asking a very different question. What is this situation doing to my mental and emotional health? That question changes everything, because when someone starts protecting their inner peace, their priorities begin to shift. They become less interested in constant social approval, less interested in drama, less willing to maintain relationships that revolve around obligation rather than genuine connection. And slowly, without announcing it to the world, they start reorganizing their lives. Some conversations fade away. Some relationships grow distant. Some environments they once tolerated no longer feel acceptable. To others, it might look like withdrawal. But inside that person's mind, something else is happening. They're learning a powerful psychological skill that many people spend their entire lives trying to develop: the ability to choose peace over noise. In today's world, where we are constantly surrounded by opinions, expectations, and emotional demands from others, that ability is incredibly rare and often misunderstood. In this audiobook, we're going to explore the deeper psychology behind people who eventually decide to cut everyone off. Not to judge them, but to understand them. We'll look at the emotional patterns that lead someone to distance themselves from entire social circles. We'll explore why emotionally strong people sometimes become quieter rather than louder. And we'll uncover the surprising truth behind a behavior that many people interpret as cold, when it may actually be a sign of something far more complex. A search for peace, a search for emotional freedom, and sometimes a search for a healthier life. But before we begin, think about someone you know. Someone who seems exhausted by the people around them. Someone who feels overwhelmed by expectations, responsibilities, and emotional pressure. If someone like that comes to mind, consider sharing this video with them. Sometimes hearing the right idea at the right moment can help someone see their life more clearly, and it might give them the courage to start protecting their own peace. Now let's begin by understanding the first quiet moment that starts this transformation. The moment a person realizes something in their life no longer feels right. Chapter 1. The moment people realize something is no longer right. There is usually a moment when the shift begins. Not a loud moment, not a dramatic one, but a small, quiet realization that something in life no longer feels the way it once did. For many people who eventually cut everyone off, the story often begins in a very ordinary place. A conversation, a dinner, a message that arrives late at night. Imagine someone sitting across from a group of friends. Everyone is talking, laughing, sharing stories. From the outside, it looks completely normal, but inside that person's mind, something feels different. They notice how the conversation keeps circling back to the same patterns. Someone complains, someone gossips, someone demands attention, and slowly they begin to notice something uncomfortable. No one is really listening. Everyone is speaking, reacting, performing, but very little true connection is happening. For a long time, they ignore that feeling, because this is what people do. They assume relationships are supposed to feel complicated. They assume social exhaustion is just part of life. They assume discomfort is the price of belonging. So they continue participating. They laugh when everyone laughs. They nod when people speak. They stay longer than they want to stay. But somewhere in the background of their mind, a small observation begins repeating itself. Something is off. At first, it feels almost like a whisper, but whispers have a strange way of growing louder when they are ignored. Over time, that person starts noticing patterns that once blended into the background. Conversations where their thoughts are interrupted. In moments when their kindness is expected but rarely returned. Situations where they are present for everyone else. But when they struggle, the room suddenly becomes quiet. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. That is what makes them so easy to tolerate. But when they accumulate, they begin to create something powerful inside the mind. Emotional awareness. Psychologists often describe this stage as the moment when a person's internal boundaries begin waking up. For years, many people operate on a kind of emotional autopilot. They maintain relationships simply because those relationships have always existed. They stay in environments because leaving feels uncomfortable. They give energy because that is the role they learned to play. But when emotional awareness begins developing, something changes. The mind starts asking questions it never asked before. Why do I feel exhausted after spending time with certain people? Why do some conversations leave me feeling smaller instead of supported? Why do I keep tolerating situations that drain my energy? These questions are dangerous in the best possible way, because once someone begins asking them, they start seeing the world differently. A comment that once seemed harmless suddenly feels disrespectful. A relationship that once felt normal suddenly feels unbalanced. A group dynamic that once felt familiar suddenly feels exhausting. This is the psychological tension that many people experience before they withdraw from others. Part of them still wants connection, but another part of them is beginning to crave something else. Peace. And when a person begins to crave peace, they start observing their life through a different lens. They begin noticing which people bring calm into the room and which people bring chaos. They begin recognizing which conversations feel meaningful and which ones feel like emotional noise. They begin realizing how much energy they have been spending just to maintain situations that do not truly nourish them. This realization is not comfortable. In fact, it can be deeply unsettling. Because when you start seeing the patterns around you clearly, you also start understanding something that is difficult to admit. Some relationships survive only because you tolerate them, not because they are healthy, not because they are supportive, but because you have never questioned them. And once that realization appears, it becomes very difficult to return to the old way of seeing things. The mind begins changing its priorities. Instead of asking, "How do I keep everyone around me comfortable?" the question becomes something entirely different. What kind of life do I actually want to live? For some people, that question leads to growth within their relationships. They begin communicating more honestly. They begin setting boundaries. They begin protecting their time and emotional energy. But for others, the answer becomes even more uncomfortable. Because sometimes the environment itself is the problem. Sometimes the group dynamics never change. Sometimes the expectations remain the same. And sometimes the only way to create peace is to slowly remove yourself from the patterns that constantly disturb it. This does not happen overnight. People rarely stand up one day and dramatically cut everyone out of their lives. Instead, the process is gradual. They begin spending less time in certain environments. They begin responding less frequently to certain conversations. They begin observing more and participating less. To outsiders, this behavior can look mysterious. Friends may notice they seem quieter. Family members may wonder why they seem distant. Some people may even accuse them of becoming cold. But internally, something very different is happening. That person is learning a psychological skill that is surprisingly rare. They are learning to listen to their own emotional signals. Instead of ignoring discomfort, they are paying attention to it. Instead of automatically maintaining every relationship, they are beginning to evaluate which ones truly belong in their life. And that shift can feel both liberating and frightening at the same time. Because the moment you start protecting your peace, you begin seeing how much noise once surrounded you. And that realization leads to the next stage of this transformation. The stage where emotional exhaustion finally reaches its limit. The stage where people stop trying to fix every relationship and begin asking whether some relationships should exist at all. And that is where the real psychological turning point begins. Chapter 2. Emotional Exhaustion. When people stop fighting, there is a point in many people's lives when something inside them becomes very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the quiet that comes after someone has been trying for too long. Before people distance themselves from others, there is usually a long period where they try to fix everything. They try to explain themselves more clearly. They try to be more patient. They try to be more understanding. When tension appears in a relationship, they are often the first to reach out. When misunderstandings happen, they are usually the ones trying to repair the situation. For a while, this effort can even feel meaningful. It gives them the sense that they are protecting the relationship. But over time, something subtle begins to change. They start noticing that the effort is not balanced. Every conversation feels like work. Every disagreement requires emotional energy. Every interaction feels like something that must be managed carefully to avoid conflict. Psychologists sometimes describe this stage as emotional labor overload. It happens when one person becomes responsible for maintaining the emotional stability of an entire relationship or group. They are the peacemaker, the listener, the one who absorbs tension so that everyone else can remain comfortable. At first, they accept this role without questioning it. Many people do, especially those who are empathetic, especially those who grew up believing that being a good person means always being the one who understands. But emotional labor has a cost, and the cost is rarely visible to others. Imagine someone who spends years being the emotional support system for the people around them. Friends come to them with problems. Family members expect them to mediate conflicts. Colleagues rely on them to keep the atmosphere calm. From the outside, this person might even appear strong, reliable, patient. But inside, something very different may be happening. Every time they absorb someone else's frustration, their own emotional reserves become slightly smaller. Every time they ignore their own discomfort to maintain peace, their internal tension grows a little stronger. Eventually, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. They begin to notice something that once seemed invisible. They are constantly holding space for others, but very few people are holding space for them. This realization can be painful, because it challenges a belief that many people carry for years. The belief that if you give enough kindness, support, and patience, the same energy will eventually return. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the person who has been giving the most energy begins to experience something that psychologists call emotional burnout. Burnout is often associated with work, but it can happen in relationships too. It feels like exhaustion that rest cannot fix. A conversation that once felt normal now feels overwhelming. A phone call that once felt friendly now feels draining. Even simple social interactions start to require more effort than they once did. At this stage, many people begin withdrawing slightly without even realizing it. They respond to messages a little slower. They decline invitations they once would have accepted. They spend more time alone, not because they dislike people, but because their emotional system is trying to recover. What makes this stage psychologically intense is that the person often feels conflicted. Part of them still cares deeply about the people around them, but another part of them is beginning to recognize that constantly sacrificing their energy is not sustainable. This internal conflict creates tension. Should I keep trying? Should I keep explaining myself? Should I keep being patient? Or is it finally time to step back? Many people stay in this stage for a long time, months, sometimes years. They keep hoping something will change. They keep believing that if they just communicate better, if they just become a little more patient, the dynamic will improve. But when the same patterns repeat over and over again, something inside the mind begins shifting. The person starts understanding a difficult truth. You cannot fix every relationship. Some people are not interested in changing the dynamic. Some people are comfortable receiving emotional energy but never offering it. And some environments remain exhausting no matter how much effort you invest in improving them. When this realization settles in, something important happens psychologically. The person stops trying to solve every problem. For the first time, they consider a different possibility. Maybe the solution is not fixing the relationship. Maybe the solution is creating distance. This thought can feel uncomfortable at first, because many people have been taught that loyalty means staying no matter what, that good people endure, that strong relationships survive through endless patience. But emotional exhaustion has a powerful way of forcing honesty. When someone reaches the limit of their emotional energy, their mind begins prioritizing survival over obligation. Instead of asking how to keep the relationship stable, they start asking a much simpler question: is this relationship healthy for me? That question marks a turning point, because once a person begins evaluating their relationships through the lens of emotional health, they start seeing things they once overlooked. They notice how certain people consistently bring stress into their life. They notice how certain conversations always leave them feeling worse. They notice how much energy they have spent trying to maintain connections that never truly felt supportive. And slowly, their perspective begins changing. They no longer see distance as cruelty. They begin seeing distance as protection. Protection of their time, protection of their energy, protection of their mental peace. This is the stage where many people stop fighting to keep every relationship alive. Not because they have become cold, but because they have become aware. Aware of their limits, aware of their emotional needs, aware that constantly sacrificing their well-being is not a sign of strength. And this awareness leads to the next step in the psychological journey, a step that many people misunderstand. Because when emotionally exhausted people finally stop fighting for relationships that drain them, so they often choose something that surprises everyone around them. They don't argue. They don't create drama. They don't try to prove anyone wrong. Instead, they quietly disappear. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Quietly Disappearing. When someone finally reaches the point of emotional exhaustion, something surprising often happens. They don't explode. They don't create dramatic confrontations, and they rarely deliver long speeches about why they are leaving. Instead, they become quiet, very quiet. For many people observing from the outside, this behavior is confusing. They expect conflict, they expect arguments, they expect the person to explain everything they've been feeling for months or even years. But when someone has reached a deep level of emotional exhaustion, the opposite often occurs. They stop trying to explain, because explaining requires energy, and by this stage, their energy has already been spent. To understand this stage, it helps to imagine a person standing in the middle of a noisy room. For a long time, they tried to be heard, they raised their voice, they repeated themselves, they clarified their intentions. But every attempt to communicate only added more noise to the room. Eventually, they reach a realization. The problem isn't that they are not speaking loudly enough. The problem is that no one is truly listening. And once someone understands that, the instinct to keep explaining begins to disappear. Psychologically, this moment represents a shift from external validation to internal clarity. Earlier in life, many people feel the need to justify their decisions. They want others to understand their perspective. They want people to see their intentions. They want approval. But emotional exhaustion often accelerates a different kind of maturity. A person begins realizing that not everyone needs to understand them, and more importantly, not everyone is willing to. This realization can feel both freeing and lonely. Freeing because it removes the pressure to constantly defend your choices. Lonely because it reveals how few people are truly interested in understanding your inner world. At this stage, something subtle changes in the way a person interacts with others. They begin observing more than they speak. They listen to conversations without feeling the need to participate in every discussion. They allow misunderstandings to exist without immediately correcting them, and slowly they begin withdrawing from the emotional battles that once consumed so much of their attention. This withdrawal is not always intentional. Sometimes it simply feels like relief. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for years without realizing how heavy it has become. The moment you finally set it down, your body feels lighter. Your breathing becomes easier. Your mind becomes clearer. In the same way, when someone stops engaging in emotionally draining interactions, they often experience a sudden sense of calm. And that calm can be addictive. For the first time in a long time, their thoughts are not dominated by tension. They are not replaying conversations in their mind. They are not worrying about how someone might react to their next message. They are simply existing without constant emotional pressure. This new experience of quiet can feel so valuable that the person begins protecting it. They start spending more time alone. Not in isolation, but in intentional solitude. Solitude allows the mind to recover, and it allows a person to rediscover parts of themselves that were overshadowed by constant social demands. During this period, many people begin noticing something unexpected. Their life feels simpler. Without constant drama, their thoughts become clearer. Without endless obligations, their schedule becomes lighter. Without the pressure to please everyone, their emotional world becomes calmer. This simplicity can feel unfamiliar at first. Many people have spent years believing that relationships must be complicated. They assume tension is normal. They assume stress is unavoidable. But when those patterns disappear, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. And this is when the quiet withdrawal often becomes visible to others. Friends might notice that the person is no longer participating in group chats as often. Family members may wonder why they seem less available. Co-workers might notice they no longer involve themselves in workplace drama. At first, people may assume the person is simply busy. But over time, the distance becomes more obvious. Some people respond with curiosity, others respond with criticism. They may say things like, "You've changed," "You're acting distant," "You used to be more involved." These reactions can create another psychological challenge, because the person who has stepped back now faces a difficult choice. Do they return to the same exhausting patterns to make others comfortable? Or do they continue protecting the peace they have finally discovered? For many people, this decision marks a major turning point. Earlier in their life, they might have chosen the first option. They might have returned to the noise just to avoid disappointing others. But after experiencing genuine emotional calm, returning to constant chaos feels much harder. They begin realizing something important. Peace is not something that happens accidentally. It is something that must be protected, and protecting it often requires difficult boundaries. This is the stage where quiet distance gradually transforms into something more intentional. The person is no longer simply recovering from emotional exhaustion. They are beginning to reshape their life. They start becoming more selective about who they spend time with, more selective about the conversations they participate in, more selective about the environments they allow into their daily experience. And while this transformation may appear sudden to others, the truth is very different. The decision to step away was forming long before anyone noticed the silence. It was built through months, sometimes years, of emotional fatigue, through countless moments of feeling unheard, through repeated patterns that slowly revealed which relationships were supportive and which ones were simply draining. By the time someone begins quietly disappearing, the internal decision has often already been made. And this leads to a powerful question that many people eventually confront. If distance creates peace, what happens when someone fully commits to protecting that peace? Because once a person experiences the psychological freedom that comes from stepping away from emotional chaos, they often begin discovering something even more transformative. The power of boundaries. Chapter 4. When protecting your peace becomes a priority. There is a subtle but powerful shift that happens in the mind of someone who has spent too long feeling emotionally drained. For a long time, their focus was outward. They were thinking about other people, how to avoid conflict, how to keep relationships stable, how to maintain harmony even when it required personal sacrifice. But after emotional exhaustion and quiet withdrawal, the direction of their attention begins to change. Slowly, almost cautiously, they start asking a different kind of question. Not, "How do I keep everyone around me comfortable?" but something far more personal. What actually makes my life feel peaceful? This question may seem simple, but psychologically, it represents a turning point. Because many people spend years, sometimes decades, living without ever seriously asking it. They follow routines, they maintain relationships, they fulfill expectations placed on them by family, friends, or society. And somewhere along the way, they become so focused on maintaining stability for everyone else that they forget to evaluate the emotional cost of that stability. But once someone experiences emotional exhaustion, their awareness sharpens. They begin noticing how certain environments affect their mood. They start recognizing how certain conversations affect their energy. Some interactions leave them feeling calm, understood, and supported. Others leave them tense, frustrated, or strangely empty. This new awareness changes how they move through the world. Before, they may have tolerated tension without thinking twice. Now, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine someone leaving a loud, chaotic room and stepping into a quiet space. At first, the silence might feel unusual, but after a few minutes, their body begins to relax. Their thoughts slow down, their breathing becomes deeper. In that moment, they realize something important. The noise they were surrounded by was never normal. They had simply grown used to it. The same realization often happens emotionally. Once a person experiences genuine peace, even briefly, they start recognizing how much tension once filled their daily life. and naturally, they begin wanting more of that peace. This desire leads to the development of something many people struggle with: boundaries. Boundaries are often misunderstood. Some people interpret them as walls, others see them as rejection. But psychologically, boundaries are something much simpler. They are decisions about what kind of energy someone is willing to allow into their life. A boundary might look like declining a conversation that constantly turns negative. It might mean limiting time spent with someone who consistently brings drama. It might mean refusing to participate in situations where respect is absent. For people who are used to prioritizing others, setting boundaries can feel uncomfortable at first. Guilt often appears. They may worry that they are being selfish. They may fear disappointing people who have grown accustomed to their availability. But over time, something interesting happens. The more someone protects their peace, the more clearly they begin seeing the difference between healthy relationships and draining ones. Healthy relationships respect boundaries. They allow space for honesty. They do not require constant emotional sacrifice. Draining relationships, on the other hand, often react negatively to change. When someone who once tolerated everything begins setting limits, certain people become uncomfortable. They may accuse the person of changing. They may say the person has become distant or difficult. But what they are often reacting to is something much simpler. They are reacting to the loss of unlimited access. When someone stops accepting unhealthy dynamics, the people who benefited from those dynamics are the first to notice. This can create another moment of psychological tension. The person protecting their peace must decide whether they will return to old habits to keep others comfortable, or remain firm in the boundaries they are building. For many people, and this stage requires courage, because boundaries do not always produce immediate harmony. In fact, they often reveal the true nature of relationships. Some people adjust and respect the new limits. Others slowly fade away. At first, this loss can feel unsettling. A person may wonder whether they are becoming too distant. They may question whether protecting their peace is worth the social consequences. But something important begins happening during this process. As draining connections fall away, space opens for something healthier. Time once spent managing emotional chaos becomes available for reflection, creativity, and rest. Conversations become fewer, but deeper. Relationships become smaller, but more meaningful. And gradually, a new realization forms. A peaceful life does not require a large number of connections. It requires the right ones. The ones built on respect, the ones built on honesty, the ones that do not demand constant emotional labor just to survive. When someone understands this, their priorities become clearer. They stop measuring the value of their life by how many people surround them. Instead, they begin measuring it by how their life actually feels: calm, balanced, authentic. And this transformation can feel almost revolutionary. Because in a world where constant communication and endless social interaction are often encouraged, choosing peace over noise can appear unusual. But for the person who has already experienced emotional exhaustion, the decision becomes simple. They are no longer interested in maintaining every relationship. They are interested in maintaining their well-being. And once someone begins protecting their peace with intention, the next stage of their journey becomes even more powerful. They discover something that many people spend their entire lives searching for: the quiet strength of learning to be alone. Chapter 5. Why strong people learn to be alone. One of the biggest misunderstandings about people who cut everyone off is the belief that they must hate being around others. But that is rarely the real story. In fact, many of the people who eventually distanced themselves from everyone were once the most socially present individuals in their circles. They were the ones who showed up, the ones who listened, the ones who stayed late to support friends, comfort family members, or help resolve conflicts. They valued connection deeply. which is exactly why the transformation they go through can be so surprising. Because when these individuals eventually step back from the social world around them, it is not because they suddenly stopped valuing people. It is because they discovered something many people never learn: the difference between loneliness and solitude. At first glance, these two states may appear identical. Both involve being alone. Both involve distance from others. But psychologically, they are very different experiences. Loneliness is the feeling of wanting connection and not having it. It carries a sense of emptiness, a sense of something missing. Solitude, on the other hand, is chosen. It is the decision to step away from noise in order to reconnect with oneself. And for people who have spent years managing emotional chaos, solitude can feel like discovering an entirely new world. For the first time in a long time, their environment becomes quiet. There are no arguments to mediate, no emotional conflicts to navigate, no constant expectations pulling their attention in different directions. At first, this silence can feel unfamiliar. When someone has lived in constant social activity, stillness can feel almost uncomfortable. The mind may initially search for the familiar patterns of stimulation it once relied on. But over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The quiet starts to feel peaceful. The absence of tension becomes noticeable. The mind begins to relax in ways it has not experienced for years. Psychologists often describe solitude as an important space for emotional recalibration. When someone steps away from constant social input, their thoughts have time to settle. Their emotional system has time to recover. And in that quiet, people often begin rediscovering parts of themselves that were hidden beneath years of social expectations. They remember interests they once ignored. They reconnect with ideas they never had time to explore. They start noticing their own thoughts rather than constantly reacting to the thoughts of others. This period of solitude can become deeply transformative. Because when someone learns to be comfortable alone, something powerful happens psychologically. They become less dependent on external validation. For many people, social environments provide constant feedback, approval, attention, recognition. While these experiences can feel rewarding, they can also become addictive. Some individuals spend years shaping their behavior around the reactions of others. They choose what to say based on what will be accepted. They choose what to do based on what will be praised. They choose what to believe based on what will avoid criticism. But solitude interrupts that pattern. When someone spends time alone, there is no audience, no expectations, no pressure to perform. And without that pressure, people often begin making decisions based on something deeper than social approval. They begin listening to their own values. They begin evaluating their life based on internal standards rather than external reactions. This shift creates a new kind of psychological strength. Because when someone becomes comfortable with solitude, they are no longer afraid of losing access to social environments that drain them. They understand something important. Being alone is not the worst possible outcome. Living in constant emotional tension is. This realization changes how a person approaches relationships. Instead of clinging to every connection, they become selective. They stop tolerating dynamics that once felt unavoidable. They begin choosing relationships that genuinely support their well-being. And when a connection consistently brings stress rather than peace, they feel less pressure to maintain it. Not because they have become detached from humanity, but because they have learned that their emotional health matters. Ironically, people who become comfortable with solitude often develop healthier relationships later. Because their connections are no longer built on fear of being alone. They are built on genuine compatibility, respect, mutual understanding. In this way, solitude becomes a filter. It removes the relationships that survive only through obligation, and it reveals the ones that exist through genuine connection. But there is another psychological change that occurs when someone grows comfortable being alone. They become harder to control. Many unhealthy social dynamics rely on subtle forms of pressure. fear of exclusion, fear of disappointing others, fear of being misunderstood. But when someone no longer fears solitude, those pressures lose much of their influence. They no longer feel forced to remain in environments that drain them. They no longer feel obligated to participate in conversations that diminish them. They become free to step away, and that freedom can make others uncomfortable. Because people who cannot be controlled through guilt, approval, or social pressure are much harder to manipulate. But for the person who has discovered the value of solitude, this freedom is not about rejecting the world. It is about protecting their inner stability. They understand something that many people only realize after years of struggle. Peace is not something the world automatically gives you. It is something you must deliberately protect. And sometimes, protecting it requires stepping away from the crowd long enough to remember who you are without it. Yet solitude is not the final stage of this psychological journey. Because once someone becomes comfortable standing alone, they begin discovering an even deeper transformation. They begin developing emotional independence. Chapter 6: The Dangerous Freedom of Emotional Independence. There is a stage in this psychological journey that many people never expect. After the exhaustion, after the quiet withdrawal, after learning to be comfortable in solitude, something even more powerful begins to develop. Emotional independence. This is the point where a person no longer organizes their life around the reactions of others. Earlier in life, many people move through the world with an invisible system guiding their decisions. They think about how their choices will be perceived. They worry about disappointing people. They measure their actions against the expectations of family, friends, and society. This pattern is deeply human. We are social beings. Our brains are wired to seek acceptance and avoid rejection. For thousands of years, belonging to a group meant survival. But in the modern world, this instinct can sometimes trap people in environments that quietly damage their well-being. Because when someone constantly prioritizes approval, they may remain in situations that drain them simply to avoid conflict. They stay in conversations that make them uncomfortable. They maintain relationships that no longer feel supportive. They tolerate disrespect in order to preserve social harmony. For a long time, this behavior may feel normal, even responsible. But once someone begins developing emotional independence, their perspective changes. They start seeing something clearly that once remained invisible. Approval is not the same as respect. A group may accept someone as long as that person continues fulfilling a certain role. The listener, the problem solver, and the one who never causes trouble. But the moment that person begins asserting boundaries or prioritizing their own well-being, the dynamic often shifts. Some people respond with confusion, others respond with frustration, because emotional independence disrupts expectations. When someone stops seeking constant approval, they become less predictable. They no longer automatically agree with everyone. They no longer remain silent when something feels wrong. And they no longer stay in situations simply because they always have. This transformation can feel threatening to people who are comfortable with the old dynamic. They may accuse the person of changing. They may say the person has become distant, difficult, or even selfish. But what is actually happening is much simpler. And the person has stopped organizing their life around the comfort of others. And for the first time, they are organizing it around their own emotional stability. This stage often creates a surprising kind of freedom. Because once someone realizes they do not need universal approval, many fears begin disappearing. They stop worrying about being misunderstood. They stop worrying about whether every decision will be liked. They stop feeling responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. Instead, they begin focusing on something far more realistic, living in alignment with their values. That alignment becomes the new guide for their decisions. They ask themselves questions like, does this environment support the kind of life I want to build? Does this relationship bring mutual respect? Does this situation allow me to feel mentally and emotionally stable? If the answer is no, they no longer feel obligated to stay. And this is where emotional independence becomes powerful, because it allows a person to step away from dynamics that once felt unavoidable. It allows them to say no without feeling guilty. It allows them to walk away from conversations that once would have consumed hours of emotional energy. It allows them to protect their peace without constantly explaining why. For someone who spent years trying to maintain harmony in every relationship, this can feel revolutionary. But emotional independence also carries a hidden challenge. It can reveal how many relationships were built primarily on expectation rather than genuine connection. Some people will adapt. They will respect the new boundaries. They will appreciate the honesty that emotional independence brings. But others may slowly disappear, not because they were intentionally rejected, but because the old dynamic that kept the relationship alive no longer exists. At first, this shift can feel unsettling. A person may look around and realize their social circle has become smaller. Conversations that once filled their days are now fewer. Invitations that once felt constant may become rare. But something important begins to replace the noise that has disappeared. Clarity. Without the pressure of constant social expectations, the mind becomes calmer. Decisions become easier. Energy, once spent navigating complicated dynamics, becomes available for more meaningful pursuits. And slowly, the person begins building a life that feels more authentic. They choose relationships that feel natural rather than obligatory. They invest their attention in environments that support their growth. They spend their time in ways that align with their personal values rather than external pressure. From the outside, this life may appear quieter, but internally, it often feels far richer. Because emotional independence allows a person to experience something that many people spend years searching for. Self-trust. The confidence that their decisions do not need constant validation. The understanding that protecting their peace is not selfish. And the awareness that their life does not need to look like everyone else's in order to be meaningful. Yet emotional independence leads to one final realization that can be difficult for others to understand. The person who once felt obligated to maintain every relationship now recognizes a powerful truth. Not every connection is meant to last forever. Some relationships belong to a certain chapter of life, and once that chapter closes, the healthiest choice may simply be to move forward, quietly, without resentment, without explanation, just continuing the journey toward a life that feels more peaceful, more honest, and more aligned with who they have become. Chapter 7. The misunderstood reality of cutting people off. When someone begins distancing themselves from many people in their life, one reaction almost always appears. Misunderstanding. Friends may say the person has become cold. Family members may wonder why they are no longer as available. Some people may even assume the individual believes they are better than everyone else. But what most observers fail to recognize is the long internal process that led to this change. Because by the time someone begins cutting people off, the decision rarely comes from arrogance. More often, it comes from awareness, an awareness that has been developing quietly for years. Earlier in life, many people believe relationships must be maintained at all costs. They feel responsible for keeping connections alive. They worry about disappointing others, and they fear being perceived as disloyal if they step away from a relationship that no longer feels healthy. Because of this, they tolerate many situations that slowly wear down their emotional stability. They stay in conversations that leave them feeling smaller. They maintain friendships that revolve around drama. They continue engaging with people who constantly demand their energy, but rarely offer support in return. At first, these compromises feel like part of normal social life. But over time, the emotional toll becomes harder to ignore. Eventually, the person begins recognizing a difficult truth. Not every relationship grows in the same direction. Some people evolve. They become more self-aware. They begin prioritizing emotional health. But others remain comfortable in patterns that revolve around conflict, negativity, or imbalance. And when these two paths begin separating, tension appears. The person who is changing may try to maintain the relationship at first. They may attempt to explain their boundaries. They may try to encourage healthier communication. But when those efforts repeatedly fail, they begin to realize something important. Growth is not always shared. Sometimes the only way to continue evolving is to step away from environments that no longer align with who you are becoming. This realization can feel uncomfortable, because stepping away from familiar relationships can create a sense of uncertainty. People who once felt like permanent parts of your life may slowly become distant. Daily conversations may disappear. Routines that once filled your schedule may suddenly become empty. But within that emptiness, something else often begins forming. Clarity. Without the constant influence of people who expect you to remain the same, your mind has space to grow. You begin thinking differently. You begin evaluating your life with greater honesty. You start asking deeper questions about what kind of relationships truly support your well-being. And slowly, you begin recognizing that many connections were maintained not because they were healthy, but because they were familiar. Familiarity can be powerful. It can keep people attached to patterns that no longer serve them. But once someone becomes aware of this dynamic, they may begin making choices that surprise the people around them. They stop engaging in certain conversations. They decline invitations that once felt automatic. They limit interactions with individuals who consistently bring negativity into their lives. To others, this behavior may appear harsh, but internally, it often feels like relief. Because cutting someone off is rarely about punishing them. It is about protecting yourself. It is the recognition that your emotional energy is limited, and that where you choose to invest that energy will shape the quality of your life. Some people struggle to understand this perspective. They believe loyalty requires constant availability. They believe relationships should be preserved regardless of the emotional cost. But healthy loyalty is not the same as self-sacrifice. A relationship should not require someone to repeatedly ignore their own well-being just to keep it alive. Over time, people who have learned this lesson begin approaching relationships differently. They no longer measure connection by how long someone has been in their life. Instead, they evaluate relationships based on something far more meaningful: respect, support, emotional balance. If a relationship consistently lacks these qualities, they begin questioning whether it truly deserves a permanent place in their life. This does not mean they stop caring about others. In fact, many people who cut others off still feel compassion toward them. They may understand that those individuals are dealing with their own struggles. They may even wish them well. But compassion does not require proximity. You can wish someone the best while still choosing distance. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional maturity. It is possible to care about people and still recognize that your life is healthier without their constant presence. And once someone understands this, their decisions become clearer. They stop feeling obligated to maintain every connection. They stop feeling guilty for protecting their peace. They begin accepting that not everyone is meant to walk the same path forever. Some relationships belong to earlier chapters of life, chapters where different versions of ourselves existed. But as people grow, their priorities change, their values shift, their understanding of emotional health becomes stronger, and when that growth leads them in a new direction, holding on to every past connection can become impossible. Eventually, they accept a truth that once seemed uncomfortable. Letting go is sometimes part of growing, and once a person accepts this, the final stage of their transformation begins. Because after learning to walk away from draining relationships, they begin discovering what it truly means to build a life that feels peaceful. Chapter 8. The life that begins after the noise. By the time someone reaches the final stage of this journey, their life often looks very different from the way it once did. Not necessarily louder, not necessarily more dramatic, but noticeably calmer. For someone who once felt surrounded by constant emotional noise, this change can feel almost unreal. There are fewer arguments, fewer exhausting conversations, fewer moments where they feel responsible for managing the emotions of everyone around them. At first, this quieter life may feel strange. Human beings are deeply social, and stepping away from many relationships can initially create a sense of uncertainty. The mind may occasionally ask questions like, did I go too far? Did I distance myself from too many people? Should I try to reconnect with the old dynamics? Any of these thoughts are natural. When someone leaves familiar patterns behind, the brain sometimes tries to return to what once felt normal, even if that normal was unhealthy. But as time passes, something important begins to happen. The person starts noticing how their daily life actually feels. They wake up with less tension. Their mind spends less time replaying past conversations. They experience fewer emotional conflicts that once dominated their thoughts. And gradually, they begin recognizing something powerful. Peace is not boring. Peace is freedom. Freedom from constantly managing other people's expectations. Freedom from environments that drain emotional energy. Freedom from relationships that require constant sacrifice to survive. For many people, this is the first time in their life they experience this level of emotional clarity. And without the constant noise of draining interactions, their mind becomes sharper. Their focus improves. They begin thinking about their future in ways they never had time to consider before. Some people rediscover passions that were once buried beneath years of social obligations. They explore creative interests. They invest time in learning. They develop new goals that reflect who they truly are, rather than who others expected them to be. Others simply enjoy the quiet stability that comes from a life without constant conflict. They appreciate calm mornings, meaningful conversations, moments where their mind feels clear rather than overwhelmed. And slowly, they begin understanding something that once seemed impossible. Life does not become empty when unnecessary relationships disappear. It becomes more intentional. The connections that remain often become deeper. Instead of dozens of shallow interactions, they may have only a few meaningful relationships. But those relationships are built on mutual respect. There is less pressure to perform, less pressure to prove loyalty through endless sacrifice. The connection feels balanced, and that balance allows the relationship to grow in a healthier way. This is one of the greatest psychological benefits of learning to protect your peace. It filters your life. It removes connections that survive only through obligation, and it reveals the ones that exist through genuine care. When someone experiences this shift, their understanding of relationships changes permanently. They no longer believe that having many people around them automatically means they are living a full life. Instead, they recognize that the quality of relationships matters far more than the quantity. One honest conversation can mean more than 100 superficial ones. One supportive friendship can outweigh years of emotionally draining connections. This realization brings a deep sense of clarity. The person no longer feels pressured to rebuild the same social world they once had. They are no longer interested in returning to environments that demanded constant emotional labor. Instead, they move forward with a new philosophy. Protect the peace you worked so hard to find. This does not mean avoiding people entirely. It means choosing wisely. It means allowing relationships to develop naturally rather than forcing them to survive out of habit. It means recognizing early when certain dynamics are unhealthy and stepping away before emotional exhaustion returns. And perhaps most importantly, It means trusting yourself, trusting that you can build a life that feels stable without needing the approval of everyone around you. For many people, this trust becomes the foundation of a new chapter in their life. A chapter defined not by constant social activity, but by emotional clarity. A chapter where their energy is invested in growth rather than survival. A chapter where relationships are chosen intentionally rather than maintained automatically. Looking back, the person may even feel gratitude for the difficult experiences that led them here. Because without those moments of exhaustion, they might never have discovered the importance of protecting their peace. Without the discomfort of letting go, they might never have created the space necessary for a healthier life to emerge. And that is perhaps the most important lesson in this entire journey. Cutting people off is rarely about rejecting the world. It is about making room for a life that feels calm, honest, and emotionally sustainable. A life where connection is still possible, but only with the people who truly deserve a place in it. Protecting your peace is not losing people. It's finding yourself. Throughout this journey, we've explored a process that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. The slow realization that something in their life no longer feels right. The emotional exhaustion that builds after years of trying to maintain relationships that constantly drain their energy. Or the quiet withdrawal that begins when a person stops fighting every emotional battle. The discovery of solitude, emotional independence, and eventually, a new understanding of what healthy connection truly looks like. From the outside, this transformation can sometimes look harsh. When someone becomes quieter, when they stop explaining themselves, when they distance themselves from people who once filled their daily life, others may interpret it as rejection. But the deeper psychological reality is very different. Most people who go through this process are not trying to punish anyone. They are trying to protect something that they may have ignored for a long time, their inner peace. Because the truth is, peace does not happen automatically. It requires awareness, it requires honesty, and sometimes it requires the courage to step away from situations that once felt familiar, but no longer feel healthy. For many people, this is one of the most difficult lessons in life. We are taught from an early age that maintaining relationships is always the right thing to do. We are taught that loyalty means staying, that patience means enduring, that leaving makes us appear selfish. But emotional maturity teaches a more balanced truth. Healthy relationships should not require someone to sacrifice their well-being just to keep them alive. They should not depend on one person constantly absorbing tension, managing conflict, or ignoring their own emotional needs. Real connection feels different. It feels supportive, respectful, balanced. And when someone finally experiences relationships like that, they begin understanding why protecting their peace matters so much. Because peace is not the absence of people. It is the presence of the right ones. The people who respect your boundaries, the people who listen as much as they speak, the people who do not require you to shrink yourself in order to remain connected. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this. You do not need to remove everyone from your life in order to create peace, but you do need the courage to recognize which relationships belong in the life you are building and which ones belong to an earlier chapter of your story. Letting go of certain connections does not erase the past. It simply creates space for something healthier to grow. Space for clarity. Space for emotional stability. And space for the kind of life where your energy is invested in growth rather than survival. So if you find yourself going through this process, if you feel the quiet urge to protect your peace more carefully than you once did, remember that this is not a sign of becoming cold. It may be a sign that you are becoming more aware of what truly matters. A life where you are surrounded not by noise, but by genuine connection. Not by obligation, but by mutual respect. And not by constant emotional exhaustion, but by a sense of calm that allows you to finally breathe again. Because in the end, protecting your peace is not about pushing the world away. It is about creating a life where the people who remain bring light, understanding, and balance into the space you have worked so hard to protect.